Hello everyone, today we talk about pirates and privateers in medieval and essentially early modern Europe. We never discussed this and probably we will not do it much again in the future, but as you know, we are not yet in depth with modern warfare, and naval history, especially at this early time, is somewhat contained relatively to especially the terrestrial one. But it's a very fascinating topic and even part of specific countries' folklore. Today we will try to give a look at a broader phenomenon, right? Paralleling to other dynamics that we have seen also when discussing early modern warfare, this kind of scum of society that fundamentally was becoming a systemic, substantial presence in Europe, as wherever Europeans went fundamentally, and especially sometimes in the, as you know, the West Atlantic, the frontier world of the West, that where so many kind of refugees, criminals, escapees, whatever, took refuge. There is, however, a lot of this happening still in the old world. We have seen it sometimes. Piracy was a thing, was important. I don't know, thinking even about the Hanseatic League during the Middle Ages, the Zaporozhian Cossacks in Ukraine, and still maybe up to very late in time, and the Mediterranean proper, that was still in the early modern age fundamentally very active in relative terms compared to the rest of maritime activity. Naturally, this is a moment in which all the major maritime dynamics were shifting towards the Atlantic and beyond, from there to the rest of the world. So we can't cover everything, but I would like to provide also with some note on some even quote from, say, certain pirates slash privateering. We'll see that the difference is actually quite blurred. In areas that are much closer to home, right, than the Antilles, the Caribbean islands, and so on. And we talk about jeu de massacre, right? That is been termed like that, right? In a sad way on the one hand, and romantically on the other. That is often in our culture popularized with the symbol of the so-called Jolly Roger, right? The black flag with skull and crossbones, right? And in reality, the origin of that banner specifically is very controversial. It may be that, as we'll see at first, it was not even black, but derived from the red flags used by Buccaneers in their properly alimentary customs. And even its typology was never definitely fixed in the aspect that we believe to have been generalized, that pattern. Pirates and their semi-legal or unilaterally legal, would be better to say, relatives, the Corsairs, must of course be framed in turn, as we were saying before, in a broader context, that of the 16th and 17th century society, with its economic crisis, wandering as a mass event and, quote, social banditry, like Eric J. Obsbone has likely termed it. And social banditry on the one hand, therefore, took banditry on the other, right? Management of the oceanic space for yet another, right? If you look at the Americas, so this continent yet to be conquered, and of a world fluid and dynamic social military connotation. Piracy, you see, today I could have talked to you about medieval piracy as well, right? There are lots of problems that we still have in popular culture, and at some levels by scale also perspectively in historiography, to properly acknowledge what piracy has been. Also, this is a dear topic to our broader civilizational way of seeing things. We often attribute to pirates some kind of, value, or even we identify it some kind of moral, higher moral virtue of, freedom or whatever. But we have to acknowledge that in every case, from the Vikings to the Saracens, to any other people that actually began to do this in any moment of local instability, so as a consequence, actually not as a cause even of some decline, were fundamentally scum. Right, they in civilizational terms, they were just essentially slave traders, scrupulous exploiters, and were driven by. And this has been studied in depth. Like, even look at Viking historiography at this point in our in our world, in our modern perspective. There was substantially no other motivation for what they did. Right, that was, of course. There are broader dynamics that we'll see in part here, the needs of overpopulation, colonization, but there's no way around about the lifestyle that they led and what this was aimed to at the end of the day, because there is no different motivation at the end of the day from other dynamics that you can even find on land, from brigandage, etc. It's just the difference that, at sea you can do more things, in a sense. You can exploit more because simply traveling by sea is easier. Right, contrarily to the broader perspective, to having a territorial, giving a territorial dimension to such exploits and enterprises is more risky, right, and it's more difficult to make it last on the longer run. And of course, I won't digress in this, but even modern piracy has been somewhat, people instinctively tend to sympathize with the less disciplined and the less civilized, right? Because that's how, evolutionarily speaking, we are designed before reason. And this, unfortunately, has nothing to do with what is at the core root as a pillar of our civilization. And it's actually an anti-civilizational value in itself, as the concept of freedom is actually not freedom, and rather liberty and negotiation and constructive approach that develops civilization. So these activities were indeed a very serious problem, and you would have not liked these individuals by any stretch of the imagination, if not realizing that the world of the time, that was still undergoing essentially a consolidation, especially in the modern age, also, part of the late medieval realities we will see today, towards a statual form, surely provided for enough room for these sacks of, desperate, etc., to make kind of their own rule, right? As this is absolutely normal. It's not a surprise that piracy, that privateering properly, as the golden age of piracy, etc., would end with, together with the 17th century, but by the 18th, also the world's navies and their states would manage to essentially control the oceanic space at some levels for which these activities, at least on a large scale, systematically were not remunerative. It's not before the Victorian age that naval technology would actually allow to literally dominate certain surfaces of sea, etc., on a longer capacity, and therefore properly freeze also the areas of action, more in a less escapable way. Naval warfare at this time was, you see, you couldn't quite block really a fleet sometimes, right? There was no way to patrol the sea enough to block, to provide, and there were always therefore some ways to get through. In fact, as we will see, there is a revival even during the 7 Years' War, or the Napoleonic Wars, where also other dynamics. Think about the Continental Bloc and the enacted by Napoleon, and the fact that it was melting apart, if anything, because of the same smugglers and sometimes the same French at some level, as we will see, that had contributed, in fact, in the previous centuries to piracy consistently, also in the Americas, etc. So it's a very complex topic and cannot be surely cut so short and simply. But we have to give it that, in a way, was normal in pre-industrial societies, but there is properly, it wasn't even in those times a fundamentally anything considered by average moral standards positive, or endowed with any kind of other objective rather than looting and slave trading, whatever. That was essentially what piracy always existed for. And always remember this, that piracy always appears as a consequence of crisis of certain systems, or yes, the opening at least of a weaker authority, as think about the Americas, as soon they were discovered, and how long it took before giving it a stable control, at least from a territorial level, political domination. But let's say this should be remembered also, as legal forms aside, the border between Corsairs and pirates is often blurred, right, and uncertain, right, and sometimes it seems to be completely erased, sometimes based on matters of, let's say, kind of life, probably of lifestyle and group ritualism, right. There is a lot in these communities that we've seen elsewhere since, think about the ancient war bands, the comitatus, etc. We find piracy even during the migration era, in a certain sense, with this sense of kinship, of esprit de corps, of sense of belonging, if you want. And even so, this happened through the marginalization that was taking place in the modern world of these elements of societies that literally felt as citizens of the world, if you want to romanticize that, but let's say devoid of any specific attachment to any flag or country whatsoever. Although, as we'll see, that the same privateering was based on, it was a form of mercenary aid, right? It was the same that we see on land during the centuries of, think about Wallenstein, think about all these figures that we don't have even to think they were individually less than others. I mean, there were lots of noblemen, for example, that enjoyed this bit. Why? Because they could invest in that. Think about the Elizabethan sea dogs, right? Many made the fortune literally from scratch, but others were, kind of almost respectable people that were simply entrepreneurs that turned into pirates, and as it had always been the case fundamentally. So the detention or less of the so-called lettre de marque, right, from which also the English term derives, is not even a defining criterion, I would say. So I also will not insist, since we don't believe in it too much, right, on such distinction between Corsairs and pirates, right. However, it will be appropriate to recall it, right. The privateering, as we call it, consists, as we know, of the, say, set of war actions carried out by private entrepreneurs, captains, let's say, with their crews, against ships of certain countries, and not all of them, on the basis of an authorization from a recognized government on the international level, right? In this limitation and this recognition consists the formal distinction between Corsairs and pirates, who instead attack indiscriminately, right? They make no distinction between their objectives. They're brigands, give themselves up to a bellum contra omnes that recognizes no authority and does not make use of the recognition of anyone. And in short, they exercise their sanguinary profession only out of thirst of booty, as we've seen, without resorting, not officially at least, to legal or political coverages of any kind, which even in here, in Clausewitzian terms, was kind of always the case, right? There is no such thing like a group of pirates that leaves completely outside any kind of external political interference, right? It's not that if you have a letter of marque, you say, okay, I'm a privateer, therefore I work for a political group. The same balance between colonial powers was obviously ridden by pirates themselves, right? And there was surely, even in there, from the relative authorities, an acceptance, tolerance even for considering the objectives, etc. But there is no such distinction a priori. This is the important thing between saying, okay, I will attack everybody, I will attack just ships of a certain nationality, because there is always a different interest on that base. That, of course, can change fluidly, so you at some point you may switch that, or you may revert to attack everybody, but always because there is a context that has brought you to do that, and not just because you're an idiot that goes out there boarding ships and stealing their goods, right? But so even in the worst of cases, there is always a broader logic that is fascinating to inquire. Then, the license to, let's say, run on the enemy was granted by issuing the aforementioned special licenses called letters of marque. So the English expression was destined to become characteristic properly of it. And these letters of marques meticulously regulated the rights and duties of their holders. Corsair activities were already flourishing, as we know, in the Middle Ages, and did not necessarily form a part of a state of war between two powers. If anything, they were connected to the legal mechanism of retaliation. Not only, also investment. We made a couple of years ago that video on Roger de Flor that illustrates pretty well how the leader of the Catalan company actually began that, right, in the quite unstable political situation between the kingdom of Naples and one of Sicily after the Vespers, where there were a lots of gray areas in between, and where piracy began to flourish, whereas before, with the political unity under Norman times, it wasn't quite the same way. So always be mindful of the context and what was especially the condition of main powers that were operating in the area, because that's really the key to it all, right? When did the Hanseatic piracy stop? Well, when Scandinavian kingdoms became stronger, right? And even here there is a deep, state building, especially in case of certain powers. Think about Sweden, the 16th century naval engineering there. The first ships built properly with the design of being military naval structures, right? That's not just a normal cargo ship fundamentally armed like it had been for centuries before. States put an end to banditry as much as piracy, right? And when piracy ends, usually you can read in there a strengthening of properly a state authority, of public power, of a civil culture, right? That is definitely a positive thing. Now, the basic historical reason of piracy was perhaps in the fact that exactly governments arrived late, as we know, to set up state fleets. And for a long time, they allowed the affairs of the sea to be regulated as matters between private individuals. We've seen how certain properly statal powers, such as, for example, the Italian maritime republics, were basically the only naval powers de facto in medieval Europe, because they were even though they didn't have anything like a permanent fleet, de facto they could still put at sea tens of galleys in case of need, because they could simply tell to the same oligarchs that formed the government and they traded extensively and as privates, and therefore carrying out trade but piracy themselves to provide these ships in case of properly defending the city and going on. And you see there, we've made videos about this. One of for example, the Castilian fleet that was basically all Genoese. The same what goes for the French, right? So there were certain powers that dominated the sea, especially the Mediterranean in that case, and monopolized the international traffics for that matter, that acted collectively as this greater force that could, in a sense, even in their stem, such centrifugal forces, whereas, however, they were still the ones that would act kind of indiscriminately on their own, as we'll read in a while. That's, for example, a quite fascinating case, because especially cities like, think about Venice, they had a highly developed statal institutional administration. Like, so they grew a bit like modern Age powers by building ships, right? And it's not a surprise that, I don't know, in modern age, not just because of their Atlantic side, let's say, but England, France, Spain were also the most essentially centralized monarchies in Europe, the powers that developed as properly as naval powers in the first place in building colonial empires, right? And others wouldn't fundamentally make it if not carving smaller possessions and still leaving, I think, all the intertwining of this, of continental affairs and global ones at that point in the balance in the Western and consequently world balance, especially by the 19th century when Europeans dominated the world. So at the end of the Middle Ages, however, apart from the Turkish and barbarian pirates, there were several Christian pirates. This had always been the case. We can't go as far as saying, we made some videos about the Saracens, and we have explained, as what historiography tells us enough, that, think about Saracens, you say, those Muslim pirates always riding for the jihad. It was plenty of Christians. Like, if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean during the wars between the Byzantine Empire and Caliphate, you pick the average Eastern Mediterranean pirate, and there is no way to say, you find Byzantines and Arabs, Christians and Muslims, carrying out the same, on the same ships and carrying out the same thing. Let's leave aside the fact that the Arabs were ruling on Christian communities that were some of the most advanced navally speaking since the 7th century, about, Lebanon, Egypt, the Palestine, all this shipyards that had been historically, since, think about Phoenician times, Egyptian times, some of the most advanced maritime cultures of the time. They were all Christian. The ones that besieged Constantinople, 717, 18, were fundamentally Christian sailors, and willing to not to serve the Muslims, but properly, going for it, because they were the same ones that had opened the gates to the Muslims to get rid of the Byzantines in the first place. You look in Western Mediterranean, do you think that the Saracens were kind of like, these were all Muslims? It was full of Spanish, of Italians, of Christians, properly. There were Christian people, we know that. And if you know just even Saracen history, even in the intervention in, in southern France and southern Italy, you perfectly know that even penetration there was possible only because the local powers let them in for, as mercenaries, as to fight each other. Like, North Africa never had, by any stretch of the imagination, the demographic resources to make autonomously any headway in the northern shores of the Mediterranean. But even, by the 14th century, still when, for example, Boccaccio tells that the gentle Lauretta, actually speaking on his behalf in the fourth story of the second day of the Decameron, the adventure of Landolfo Ruffolo, citizen of Ravello, so technically a Neapolitan subject, right? So in a moment at the time of actual stability there was on the Campanian coast, right? So the Angevins had kind of secured the Neapolitan kingdom, and still, as we've seen, there was still this contrast with the Aragonese in Sicily, and room for kind of a lot of activities and raids on the various coasts, etc. Well, this guy, according to the novel, was a rich merchant who, having invested his own capital in a merchant voyage to Cyprus, which later turned out to be a mistaken speculation, quote, from a very rich man in a short time, almost poor he became. And he thought either to die or to steal in order to restore his damage, so that if he had been rich, he would have been rich before, he would have not come back home poor. And he found a buyer of his great ship. With that money and the one that he had acquired from his business, he bought a thin ship to run, and that properly as a corsair, and that of as a boarder, and that of everything suitable for this service he armed and equipped optimally, and he committed himself to assault anyone, and especially the Turks. This is an interesting aspect that is often overlooked, that is how early Turkish piracy actually was around, right? Especially at this point in history where the Byzantine Empire was fundamentally had already, I mean, the Paleologi had restored control in Constantinople, etc. But in Anatolia, the Turks had arrived finally to the sea. And at that point was no thing like a strong Turkish power. They were all different principalities. And however, this procured a kind of more endemic piracy in a sense than the more regulated one, also more aggressive, of course, for sure, more effective strategically, that in Ottoman times would be more famous against the Christians. But nevertheless, right, it was plenty of these small, and that's the context. Remember what I said before, that when a strong power crumbles, all of a sudden, if it's a coastal area, pirates come back. Well, that's exactly what had happened since the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, right? And the fascinating thing is that you can see this at sea as well as on land, right? From all the peoples that swarmed, raided turned the first Latin Empire, eventually the Byzantine possessions, in kind of a frontier area. We talked about this, even properly changing the strategy and the tactics, right? This idea of hit and run tactics, you find them in the Aegean as much as you find them in the Balkans. More raiders, lighter troops. It's kind of typical historical. Well, Landolfo Ruffolo's novel continues. It seems that he was angry above all with the Turks, but not only with them. He then happened to be captured and stripped not by other Corsairs, but by 2 Genoese merchant cogs, which shows how actually thin was the line that separated the merchant from the Corsair, because these were Genoese merchants, but of course they were equipped for war. They would, seize the opportunity to rob other vessels. Also to face a shipwreck and to save himself with a large jewelry box found by accident. Now, this is naturally Boccaccio's story, and not everyone was lucky as Landolfo Ruffolo, even admitting that he was a real figure. But Boccaccio, aside from spending time in Naples, famously enough, and being involved in banking, etc., he had met many of these figures actually there, and he would know, and these people existed, we know that. They're actually extensively documented at that time from a historical point of view. And this was a guy, as we've seen from Campania, the spoiler of Turks, and not only of them, that realistically also in here had to deal with the Genoese, that were the main, essentially at that point, Western Mediterranean power, aside from looking Italy as a watershed, because Venice from the other side instead impoverished. And the Genoese in turn often had to do with the late medieval Christian Corsairs, par excellence, the Catalans, right? Catalans that were rising, especially at that point, that were essentially a Ghibelline power allied with the Sicilians. Aragon seizes also Sardinia at some point from the peasants, though, but it was Ghibelline powers normally siding with the empire against instead the Guelph papal Angevin axis of Naples, Rome, Florence, France, Provence, etc. This is important because there were enormous capitals at stake. I think we made an extensive amount of videos. If you go in the Naval history playlist, you find a lot of this game, right? You know that fundamentally the Genoese the Venetians would ally with the Catalans themselves to oust the Genoese that had to open the Atlantic route to trade directly with England, with Flanders. And this Boccaccio himself writes about this, his letters, that he knew people that these were all Genoese sailors that worked for Castile, for Portugal, etc., that began to discover the islands of west of the Iberian Peninsula in the Atlantic, and began, in a sense, the age of exploration that, in fact, was taken off at the time. So these are really broader civilizational dynamics that went in parallel, famously enough, in this Mediterranean culture, was all blended in Pisan, Genoese, Catalan, etc., with, for example, scientific development of cartography, of accounting, of things that would literally, that had never been developed before and would remain fundamentally the base of European scientific branches for centuries to come, exactly up to the consolidation instead of a more global scale by modern powers. And there is an interesting text here exactly about some Genoese merchants being robbed by a Catalan pirate dating to I will simply read it, 1488, March the 31st in Banchi, which I presume is in Liguria at the time of Vespers. So this is a notary act that describes what had happened to this Genoese vessel, right? It says, Matteo Gallo di Moneglia, it was Ambrosio, was summoned as a witness and questioned promptly by me, the notary, so that he may have an eternal memory of the incident, at the request of Valentino de Clapis di Nervi, who decided to make fate of the following facts. So you have a witness here as well. He answers the truth that Valentino with a saeta, the saeta was a type of ship, means arrow or lightning, that gives you the idea also of the shape, the function, etc., and that it says with a saeta which he was the owner, right, the patron, sailed last year in October from Levanto, that is in eastern Liguria, and from there he sailed with the saeta towards Corsica. Well, the Genoese, as you know, were in possession of the island. At Lod in Corsica, he loaded on his boat some wine destined for Rome. The saeta stopped at Lod for more than 2 months, at the end of which they set sail for Rome. During the journey to Rome, the saeta was stopped with its cargo near Giglio, near Mount Argentario, by the Catalan Ubusqueta, or Ubusceta, I don't know how to pronounce it, in command of 2 of his galleys and a brig. And the saeta with its load of wine was thus captured, and all the other men fled. The witness is authentic with his oath that the facts unfolded like this. He asserts, however, that he does not remember well if the departure of the saeta occurred in the month of October for Corsica and subsequently for Rome with the said load. He answers that he embarked in Levanto when the saeta sailed for Corsica, and in Corsica, at the time of its departure for Rome, the witness was always on board of the saeta. During the journey to Rome, when the saeta was captured, with the patron and all the other men of the saeta, excluding Valentino, remained on board. The witness claims to have been paid on the saeta as a member of the crew. The interrogated witness claims to be about 59 years old. Questioned how much his assets are, he replies that he has 500 florins. Witnesses Nicola de Capriata di Costantino and Luca de Sala of the was Simone. Right? So this is fascinating because you see here there is a Catalan pirate fundamentally just off the coasts of it would be those were territories held by the Aldobrandeschi, if I'm not wrong, lordship, but you say we're south of Siena and areas that were good. The coast is very good for ambush and things like that. It would normally operate here to raid a Genoese civilian ship, and normally the Aragonese were quite competitive, and in that field, as we were saying before. They would normally, every once in a while, also oust the Genoese merchants to the same kings of Aragon would do that to cash fast, and then the Genoese would retaliate. But at the end of the day, as it always happens, it would be the same thing ever. Like even with Venice and the Ottomans, etc., it would always restart trading because they needed that, right? There was no way to make it work any other way. This is a very important aspect of piracy that has to make us get properly used to the concept of what the sea has been historically, right? A great blender of cultures, of of ideas, of technology, etc. Because it puts things in perspective, not just because it makes you know other worlds, but also because it makes you see how. Well, on land it wasn't that dramatically different, but as we've seen, the scale, the speed, especially the range of naval interaction would show how things were always changing, and therefore would oblige you to understand what much faster what would have been the best solution in such a floating space. And war was always alternated with peace, of course, but meaning that you would trade with the same people that you fought against on a regular base, and that there wasn't such thing like properly citizenry, defined international laws, states, their territorial dependencies at the time. At the time was just a huge, unstable, massive lordships that would change all the time in this regard. And it's very meaningful that, as we were saying before, the greatest civilizational developments in terms of, for example, of mathematics, cartography, we were saying before, the same naval engineering, by the way, accounting, juridical practices, the insurances, it would develop exactly here. Mm-hmm. Now, in this environment, although the formal distinction between privateering and piracy was very clear, as I was saying before, and this is, for example, already known in the Franco-English Treaty of 1495 or 96, I don't remember, called the Intercursus Magnus, right? That, you see, between two big monarchies like England and France would naturally be an important thing to do, even to start that kind of, at the root of an empire, that kind of international law that in theory kind of existed already by a certain margin, but surely, with the effects that you can imagine. In fact, in reality, the two phenomena, as we were saying before, and the close relative of both, that is smuggling, continue to flank each other, and often to go hand in hand. Right? The Corsair pirate universe was quite vast, and its borders were subjective. When we think of Mediterranean pirates, we usually refer to the Turks, the barbarians, the Uskoks too. But as we have just seen, also merchants from Campania or Genoese merchants could occasionally transform themselves into privateers to return immediately, afterwards as merchants, right, until the next occasion, perhaps. Later, the activities of the orders of Malta and of St. Stephen would have not been towards the Muslims, at least, very different from the pirate ones, right? There are beautiful studies from Fernand Braudel that studied deeply what the Mediterranean was at this time. There is all an extensive historiography looking properly at the diplomatical relations. I mean, think about all the deep political and strategical implications between the Republic of Venice, the Slavic Uskoks, all those various even republics. Think about Dubrovnik in itself, or also think about the Ottoman Empire, the connection between coast and hinterland as well. Right, for the Balkanic hinterland, for example, there is a lot of interesting dynamics in all these relations, international relations of power between bigger realities. But this is also an aspect that we tend to overlook because, let's say, the idea of the Saracens, for example, you see, in the Middle Ages would have not been so developed as we think. This was mostly resumed in early modern times, when Ottoman piracy became a substantial threat, and therefore there is all an historiography that re-evaluated this idea, yes, of the infidels that come from the sea, that raid, etc. What is, let's say, not obscured because it was clear to everybody, but still not represented ideologically in that way, is that the Christians did exactly the same thing, right? And that not only that, but there were so properly many slave centers not just with later, black African slavery into the Americas, but looking at the Mediterranean as well. There were called several Christian Tangiers. You see, Tangiers was one of the greatest centers of slave markets in Muslim world. But if you take, I don't know, in Tuscany and Livorno, that had been built as a port properly by the Medici dynasty, and where the Order of St. Stephen was properly located as with its naval power, well, here the circumcised flesh suffered the pains of slavery as well. The Christian princes were certainly not as tolerant as those Muslim leaders who instead did not disdain to deal with the mercenary fathers. Right, there was this originally a religious order founded in 1218 in Barcelona from St. Peter Nolasco, for the ransom of Christian prisoners in the infidels' hands, right? Since 1690 would count among the Mendicant orders, right? Even though the Muslims surely did ransom their own prisoners from Christian hands at some point, but that's fascinating because also there is an enormous literature. Think about Cervantes. Right, all the kidnapping, he fought at Lepanto, for example. There are all these enormous stories of, slaves that, going through the worst of experiences, but also sometimes making fortune. All these world where everything is kind of blurred at the end of the day, where you don't understand even, what was your enemy, was your friend, what are your possibilities, how long, even slavery could bring fortune, or, freedom could simply kill you. It was a harsh dimension that is somewhat overlooked. Like in Western society, you see the Mediterranean passes on the background where, the modern age, but actually it wasn't like that. For a good 200 years, the Mediterranean was easily as important as what was happening in the Atlantic, and it's just a part of our culture as Westerners that has been removed by the the popularizations and all their uncontrollable dynamics that took place in the last few generations. But we have to be aware properly of the importance of this, also because it was intertwined not just with, of course, European policy, the same Atlantic realities, but simply because there were, as we will see now, many Atlantic pirates that actually had fought in the Mediterranean against the Turks, or participating to the clash of religions in other countries in Europe, etc. So Europe is unavoidably intertwined in this, and there is no way to untangle it. But as we were saying, in fact, the place of election of the pirates would have been the Western Atlantic, and especially the Caribbean Sea. Now, insofar as Spanish hegemony was affirmed in the American continent, initiating with the great discoveries and soon made legitimate on the level of international law by the arbitration of Pope Alexander VI with Portugal, right, Tordesillas, famously enough, to the same extent, the governments hostile to Spain, that is, the French and the English, later also the Dutch, did not hesitate to grant their letters of marque to captains willing to raid the coasts and infest the Spanish gold and silver routes, right? And already in 1543, French and English privateers sacked Cartagena, the Cartagena de Indias, the one in Colombia today, and a little later, Havana. Now, to clarify the situation, it should be borne in mind that the English letter of marque, as a term, derives from the French lettre de marque, right, which means, properly speaking, commission, right? It's not different from the condotta or the indenture, right? These are the same people that use the same form of mercenary contract. But, as we were saying before, also the possession of one of these licenses was not ordinarily recognized as a document of any value by anyone who had captured a privateer. What do you care? This guy is fundamentally attacking you, is an enemy. What do you care whether, the Queen of England has given this letter of marque to it. Just take it out, right? And in any case, it's certainly because you were at war with England. That's the point. And still, generally speaking, you see that it's to be fair, it was not even this direct proportionality, because as we know, up to a certain point at least, what happened in the Americas literally stayed in the Americas. Like when the Spanish invaded Mexico, etc., was born. At the beginning, do you think that, I don't know, Charles V controlled these people? They were private landlords. They built kingdoms on their own. There was no way, factually, with coercive means of the time, to exert anything but fundamentally just to lose control. Telling the truth, on that occasion, both the emperor and the papacy made an astonishing work, even to stop the violence against the Native Americans, which is usually not, this is not part of the mainstream narrative today, because Europeans are just all bad and ugly and racist and whatever. But at the time, surely they wouldn't show any kind of tenderness, but still institutions worked to a degree of civilization that also brought some order, and the natives were anything better by any stretch of the imagination. Also, as we were saying before, the letters of marque, in any case, it certainly did not constitute a binding document in terms of practical behavior. That is to say, how did you engage, actually, the enemy, for that matter? There were some many privateer leaders that cared a lot about distinguishing themselves with great haughtiness also from the, let's say, common pirates, right? There were important interests at stake, and even careers, as we'll see in a while. Thus was born, between the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, the legend of the so-called Brethren of the Coast, of the Buccaneers. An old English and Dutch word, the origin of which practically means something like free borders, fundamentally. Now, Spanish imperial and naval power had been built by sailors and conquistadores in the service of the crown. The English one instead was founded in the Atlantic by the Corsairs of Queen Elizabeth I, the Sea Dogs. The slave trader John Hawkins, essentially the smuggler of his black goods to the planters of the Caribbean, whom the Queen knighted by granting him heraldic arms with a crest decorated with a black man in chains, by the way. Just to tell you what was undoubtedly the considerations that value attributed to human life in that sense. And there would be some kind of embarrassment by a certain level. The same Elizabeth, as you know, she was quite clever and capable, and smart, and she would also kind of close an eye, or both, sometimes, what these privateers did. So as we were saying before, it was a matter also of bluffing and it is a proxy war by a certain degree, and we know how these things work, right? But the sheer amount of violence, of oppression here, you see, the slave trade was the first thing. Like, it was easily, aside from the main precious metals, convoys that the Spanish pioneer, etc., was easily the most remunerative business, and would continue, sadly so, for centuries. But there was a big deal, naturally. It was a properly strategical interest in how the various powers were faring this time. I mean, think about the Armada with England itself. But other most famous name, Francis Drake, cousin of John Hawkins, who had risen to sudden fame for the assault in 1573 on the Potosi silver caravan, which passed through the Isthmus of Panama, a coup that had brought him a loot of 30 tons of the precious metal, and who between 1577 and 1580 would have circumnavigated the globe, thereby deserving from his sovereign the title of Sir. Walter Raleigh, former fighter in France alongside the Huguenots, right, for the Protestant cause, explorer in 1584 of the North American coast between Florida and North Carolina, explorer of Guyana in search of the El Dorado in 1595, later disgraced by James I Stuart, who had him executed. But the real filibustering would have been born from a dream, paradoxically, even an utopia, so certainly a dream of peace, paradoxically, that of the waste, of the scum of Europe, which soon began to flow to the Antilles and found, for example, in Hispaniola, so present-day Haiti, a large mass of domestic animals imported there by the first settlers, because here also, as you know, aside from entire populations literally wiped out from the face of the earth through illnesses and, cold steel, of course there was all a broader faunistic change with all the consequences of the case, and as we'll see, this would be particularly important for the pirates, even as a form of subsistence in the way they would kind of live in their precarious but effective way. In fact, leaving the old world empty-handed, quote, with one hand in front and one in the back, as a person that I don't definitely like at all, but still worth mentioning, like Ernesto Che Guevara, used to say, actually wittily answering those who questioned him about who his ancestors were, right, and stressing their, indeed, it was historically correct, the utter poverty, and, this was literally the scum of society, that, they had perhaps dreamed of the 7 golden cities. Well, he defined it fine. But in Hispaniola, they had found something equally fabulous to the 7 golden cities, that it was plentiful, fresh meat with which to satiate their ancient hunger. Well, I don't know if you realize, for a 16th century poor person, so it's already not a wealthy world by our standards, and these were literally, as we've seen, the worst of people, and what it means to be able to eat meat. Right, from the culture of turnip and wild bread to that of the good rib of ox, right, in the 16th century there was an abyss. And the pioneers of the Antilles grew in physical vigor as much as in violence. They began by exploiting to death, the phrase is not metaphorical, the natives of the place, because they wouldn't even consider them human beings, but there was an actual debate going on at the time, forcing them to break their back in the sugar cane and tobacco plantations. Products, the latter which, together with coffee, probably wouldn't do much good to the European continent, as they actually increased, as you know, that level of social alienation by these as drugs that the incipient the would-be industrial society class workers would start abusing of, and therefore being ever more marginated and exploited also in the old continent, but which certainly, as Bernard de Saint-Pierre said, have done surely great harm to America itself, because the continent grew depopulated to make room for plantations. And I don't know, the same thing about the American Civil War is in a sense even a consequence in part of that, in a broader perspective. And needless to say, to Africa, that was depopulated to provide arms with which to cultivate them, right? As you know, the American ethnic background was completely redrawn after the, with the European penetration. Now, having emptied Hispaniola of indigenous people, in fact, and this is properly one of the first genocides properly meant of the modern era, the first colonial wave had moved elsewhere, supplanted, while the rich fauna of the place actually returned to the wild, by another breed of immigrants, another handful of European scum, mostly Frenchmen. And they founded a real culture of meat and leather. Thus were born the Buccaneers, right? So called, this is the point, perhaps from the indigenous name of the beef and pork that they preserve in a simple and ingenious way, probably learned from the same natives, and consisting of a light salting and then a slow cooking over a smoky fire. So the excellent characteristics of preservation of this meat, that, as you know, for the time was a big deal, made the fortune of the Buccaneers, who smuggled it to all the ships that docked with them. Their magical moment, their golden age, days of glory, goes from 1630 to 1638. And their excellent customers were the freebooters who, in fact, around 1630 had placed themselves on the nearby island of Tortuga under the command of the Norman Belin des Nambeaux. The Spaniards hunted down the freebooters from Tortuga in 1638 and drove the Buccaneers from Hispaniola, exterminating the wild cattle that constituted their primary resource, and whose blood had perhaps given the name and color to the first flag of this world of marginalized people, the Geôlier Rouge. And it is actually very plausible that the name Jolly Roger, actually attributed to the pirate flag, stemmed from this deformation in English, an adaptation, let's say better. As you understood, the Spanish were clever because they basically took out all the animals that they subsisted themselves thanks to. So the freebooters had, were known for. As for Tortuga, in 1639, it was taken over in turn from the Spaniards by the Englishman Willis, and later by the Huguenot nobleman Levasseur, who was succeeded by Henri de Fontenay, who had fought in the Mediterranean against the Turks, under the banner of the White Cross of the Knights of Malta, by the way. So imagine just even the shared military experience at a naval level, and all the deep intertwinement of even equipment, of strategies, tactics, and so on. And so on. You could go on and on with these terrible and legendary names. Definitely people that you would have not enjoyed to meet in person, such as Jean-François No, born in Sable d'Olonne and therefore called the Olonnaise, heinous torture, killed by a Carib tribe and eaten. Well, it happens every once in a while. It's already a big deal that you're not eaten alive in that manner. Henry Morgan, Welsh, established himself since the British snatched Jamaica from the Spaniards and put the favor of the governor of this island. He became Admiral Filibustiers in 1668, the year of his formidable and cruel conquest of Portobello, a fundamental port of the Flota de Oro, right? That was, the system of complex that the Spanish had put up to safeguard their precious metal exports from American ports to Europe. The Gascon Montbard, whose hatred for the Spaniards and the reputation of torture he practiced are unbelievable. Duguay-Trouin, a native of the faithful Corsair city of France, Saint-Malo, about whom Voltaire says that he achieved fame almost equal to that of the famous Muslim Corsairs of the Mediterranean, Dragut and Barbarossa. Or Jean Bart, the hero of the other French pirate city, Dunkirk. Or again, William Kidd, who filled the caves of America, at least those of the legions, with his treasures, and the seafaring folklore of the ballads dedicated to his exploit and his appearances as a ghost. or Edward Teach, aka Blackbeard, who found a memorialist like Daniel Defoe, and that, as you know, it took a hell of hits and shots to take him down. Eventually was beheaded as proof of exposing his head on the over the ship. Finally, Bart Roberts, known as the Sun King for his elegance in dressing and who coupled the traditional cruelty of pirates with strange scruples in moral and religious matters. I think even all just the beliefs and the cultural background of these people and what it meant really to have a lifestyle like that, especially in the most properly pirate detached marginated dimension, right, where there was the collection of all the worst elements that you could imagine, as we were saying before. Tattooing is a thing that even studying anthropologically speaking had a deep meaning, even if you look at the contact that these people had with, for example, local native cultures. Even in the Pacific, there is a lot of this. I know individuals study this in their PhDs, and they're actually fascinating thing, because there is still a lot of a very few of the info that we have about those cultures, thanks to these raiders or explorers sometimes, but that also the Europeans in turn wanted to somewhat to make their own, as that, because of their type of lifestyle. Now, piracy was running out fundamentally in the 18th century, when the various trading companies changed the mercantile and colonial policy, and followed up to that point, and when the splendors of the Flota de Oro and therefore the wealth of the Caribbean coasts were no more than a memory. As you know, private companies became kind of states, right, proxy states. Think about the Company of the Indies, etc. The enormous power. They had entire armies and fleets on their own, so the capacity of naval projection, etc., was enormous. There was no way for these bandits to simply put up any kind of competitive. Like, these companies were subcontracted, and they worked for crowns. They had an enormous financial capacity. They were starting to rule the world. So there remains a lot of folklore, a lot of literature, and perhaps even some good ideas in the field of seafaring tactics, right? For example, with the resumption of boarding techniques, that for smaller vessels attacking larger ones, and even having this need of, very often, if they were inferior guns, you would try to achieve surprise to board at that point to compensate the gap in firepower, and just going to the melee. Small arms themselves, in fact, were influenced by the golden age of piracy. For example, the boarding saber, is a very agile weapon and designed for the intense melee, and also against mostly unarmored opponents at that point. Or the kind of trombone variant of a gun that essentially with a funnel-shaped barrel, which could be loaded easily despite the rolling pitch of the ship, because having a larger mouth could be filled more easily with all the movement. And also consider this in terms of tactics, that is for the adaptation of as always, as it is, arms adapt to tactics mostly, not vice versa. But at sea, where already these guns at the time didn't quite have, they had smooth barrels, so they had a ridiculous accuracy. Even with sea movement, it would be ever more complicated. Hence the boarding, and hence the need also of having sometimes larger shooting. Even, for example, think about the innovations such as the duckfoot pistol with 4 barrels arranged in a fan shape. Well, this is useful in boarding because you just can't sweep technically the deck. But even Renaissance tactics, as you know, with the turrets that would wipe out the troops from the enemy decks, were designed for that, because a lot of boarding was still going on. Or even during mutinies, you can essentially literally point the gun at 4 people at once, and surely hitting somebody in the crowd, but would however be abandoned also because of the lack of practicality in loading. But even kind of axes, big axes, all the worst kind of human body destructors at close range you can imagine. Other cases similar to pirate courses are the type of the so-called beggars of the sea, organized by the Dutch during their struggle against the Spanish along the Netherlands coast by William the Taciturn. And in short, also there was some, a reaffirmation of the principle by which it can be said that the privateer is a function of the struggle for the Atlantic telegraphy between the 16th and the 17th century in general. But of course, the Mediterranean also continued to have its pirates, not just Muslims. There is this interesting connection from a Catholic fleet. It says, on the 24th at daybreak we saw a sail with a stern wind. I then commanded to bear away to pursue her while the storm increased in intensity. He hoisted all the sails he could to try by any means to escape us. But we sailed past her, and furthermore, her sails were torn open. The sail was even carried away by the wind, and she inclined a great deal. The sea was very big, and my ship held the sea extraordinarily well, but some of my sails also tore, and the shrouds broke. Some of the older sailors aboard said that they had never seen or heard of a chase in such a storm, but I had many good reasons to justify my perseverance in the hunt. At noon I reached the ship and found that I had covered 14 leagues in a single watch, although most of the time I had been keeping the same edge. The sea and the fury of the wind were such that no boat could resist it, so I forced the ship to luff in the wind to the island of Pantelleria, from which we were about 10 leagues. Then, in calm waters, I had the captain come aboard, and found out that he was from Amsterdam, and had loaded sardines in Ireland to be delivered to Venice. I let him go then without taking anything. The vessel was about 300 tons of the finest workmanship I had ever seen. His captain told me that, according to him, no ship exceeded his sails and managed to win it in the race. He confirmed the news given to me by the captain of the Saetta I had captured in Kefalonia, of the death of the Duke of Buckingham. So if this is George of de Villiers, this is 1628. During the pursuit of the ship, however, I lost the vice flagship and the Good Hope. Now I was alone. At 3 in the afternoon I reversed the route for Sardinia, our next appointment, with a north-northwest wind. After the hunt for the Dutch ship, I pumped the water from the hold and found that it had reached 3 feet, but I think it came when a wave swept the decks, and although the superstructures were very high, it still swept over them and throughout the ship from bow to stern, hurling me along with the others, submerged by the water, to leeward. All the cannon hatches from the hip to the front had the upper part covered with water. Moreover, with all that haze kept ashore, the connections of the planking had opened and vomited tow. It was when I hoisted the sails, because otherwise the pursuit would have lasted a long time, that the chased-up ship lost heart, and it can be said that she even abandoned every maneuver, feeling lost, since she believed that I was Turkish. As she then walked away, she unloaded all her guns, and I responded with a single blank shot. On the 25th, the wind dropped somewhat, and so did the sea. In the morning I was in sight of the central part of Sicily. The wind was blowing from the west, a quarter northwest. Before night I was about the height of a large and beautiful city, with a fortified castle high on the hill. In the collection of maps I found the name of Agrigento marked just where I thought I was. The wind was from the west-southwest, but after sunset it changed to a south wind. On the 26th, on the morning of the 26th, I was right near Marittimo, with a southeasterly wind and rough sea in the bow. In the afternoon it rained, and the wind dropped. After sunset it resumed blowing from the north, turning northeast with a calm sea. On the morning of the 27th, a stiff wind from the south, a quarter of a southeast, pushed us forward 11 leagues every watch. At noon, a southerly wind, which later changed to the west, and again after sunset in an impetuous and an obstinate north wind, accompanied by rain. On the 28th, the weather was very dark, but at dawn we could see the coast of Sardinia, the island of Serpentara, and other surrounding islands. After a while, we sighted 2 ships advancing towards us, and when they got closer from their way of responding to my signals, I recognized that they belonged to my fleet. They were the Vice flagship and the Good Hope. A little before noon, one of the most terrible storms imaginable arose from the northwest, accompanied by torrential rain. But it didn't last long. Before I could scrape the yards, the foresail tore off. Throughout the day, the weather remained very bad, with the variable winds and an increasingly turbulent sea. The waves came from all over, and finally a violent storm of wind from the northwest broke out and continued throughout the night. During the storm we were all missing, but the next morning, on the 29th, we got together again near Serpentara. We then saw 6 set heading north. The Vice Admiral, my ship, took 3 in between. The other 3 escaped us, continuing the route. Of the 3 captured, 1 ran aground on the rocks and sank, so much so that we could only save the sails and 2 mortars, and we seized the flag. We towed the other 2 away, all but 1 of the men having fled ashore. All 6 were loaded with wheat, chickpeas, and cheese, and came from Naples. As soon as I arrived under the castles, where I had already stopped on the outward journey, they opened fire on me, which I answered in turn. On the 30th, we had impetuous gusts from the west, and during the night the largest and newest of the set broke the mainmast, and as a result it threw up a lot to leeward. So you see, this is a good example of what a kind of normal lifestyle in Mediterranean here by the 17th century would appear like, where a continuous turbulence, still, naval science was somewhat primitive, but still enough to hold the sea as we've seen, and to always engage in this kind of pretty random, as you understand, encounters. And as we were saying before, it was just trying to fish. The more you sailed in that sense, and the more you could find across. And it's fascinating how if there was nothing precious in the ship, you would let it away, and so on. And there was a broader view, and as you've seen, even ways of informing yourself about what was happening in the rest of the world, and this was still pretty actively the center of the world. Now, in conclusion, the Peace of Utrecht of 1713 had formally forbidden the granting of letters of marque, right? So since then, the Corsairs, if they did not completely disappear, they were downgraded to pirates, right? Hence, again, the phenomenon in its essential character, as it had always been, right, independently from this kind of more or less legitimate clothing in the practice. And we have seen what, even also during the course of the 18th century, this phenomenon also was connected to, right? It was seen as it's also a matter of probably of diplomatic incident, like who were these people, right? Fleets were becoming ever larger. There was an ever greater, capacity of recognition. Okay, lots of other ships went out there alone. There was there are very interesting also gazettes, things like that. That, for example, the British would, at least during the Napoleonic War, would keep very diligently, whereas the Frenchmen not so much. This is important also for historical reconstruction and so on. So these were crude numbers, lots of losses, but not just for war, as we understand, also for the weather and so on. Now, however, as we were hinting at before, the privateer war experienced a strong resurgence in parallel with the rest of the regular naval operations during the 7 Years' War, conceived as the first world war, because it effectively was fought, the known in all the world continents at that point, and having this, in fact, quite range of also fought in the Americas, fought in areas that were still kind of that frontier, kind of even in naval terms, of course, and therefore there was enough room for profiting of such activity. These things held researched even in World War II, even in moments that you wouldn't. They're not very famous. There is all today. We don't talk, for example, Far East piracy. That's also quite fascinating. Think about all the literature about it. This happened also in the Napoleonic era. As we were saying before, the smugglers of Saint-Malo and Dunkirk easily transformed into privateers, right? Because technically what we're doing, we're forcing the continental bloc was forbidden, and that's the same reason why, but there was no way to actually enforce it permanently and without some degree of permeability, and that's why Napoleon would invade Russia, which was fundamentally the only sensible thing to do, contrarily to what people believe, that you never invaded, and it's not because you lose eventually that you may be right. Napoleon was surely way more motivated to invade Russia than what the Nazis, in a very incompetent way, fundamentally did. And still, as we know, Russia, for that matter, was even invaded in winter by the Mongols and conquered from that point. But aside from that, these smugglers were also pretty aggressive, as you understand. They would find refuge also in other continents from across the bloc, etc. So, while on the coasts of New England, by the way, the profitable industry of intercepting ships that sailed up the Gulf current, the Gulf Stream from the West Indies flourished. Right, there is a tradition of American, probably United States privateers in a sense as well, were businessmen, kind of revered figures at home, that same kind of fueling that kind of legend of the great legacy of the pirate golden age that, however, as we've seen, was much earlier, fundamentally about, especially from the mid 17th century. So we will come back talking about these things at some point, even though probably from other points of view and or more in detail, I don't know. It's just not very likely to happen though soon, as we were saying at the very beginning of the video. For now, I was glad just even to talk about it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.